Just a quick note before we start.
Yeah.
This podcast is coming from Echoes from the Edge with the Lone Wolf. So welcome back to the deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here.
Today we are getting into something that, well, it affects literally everyone listening right now. We've got a really fascinating stack of sources today.
We do, yeah, some really heavy hitters.
Right. We're looking at excerpts from Resonant Restoration, Sentinels of Stability, and The Architecture of Accountability. And our mission for today's deep dive is to figure out why the natural world around us is just growing so noticeably quieter.
The silence of the man-made wild, as they call it.
Exactly. Why that silence is happening, why the usual things we blame are kind of letting us off the hook, and how rethinking our own backyards might actually save the systems that keep us alive.
It's a big topic.
It is. And to set the scene, I want you, the listener, to think back to a summer road trip, maybe like 20 years ago. You've been driving down the highway for hours, right? I know where you're going with this. Yeah, you pull into a gas station, and your windshield is just essentially a Jackson Pollock painting of dead bugs.
It was a mandatory ritual. I mean, you couldn't pump your gas without grabbing that little squeegee from the plastic bucket.
Right.
Because the glass was just entirely opaque, and the front grille of your car would be practically choked with insect life.
But try to remember the last time you actually had to do that, like really had to do it.
It's been a while.
Right. You can drive for hundreds of miles today, right through the absolute peak of July, and the windshield stays practically pristine.
It's eerie when you actually stop to think about it.
It really is. You pull into your driveway, step out, and look at these manicured emerald green lawns in suburban neighborhoods. They look incredibly lush, almost like velvet.
But they're empty.
Exactly. If you stand still and just watch, nothing lands, nothing buzzes. And the ecological analyses we're diving into today refer to this as the silence of the man-made wild. Once you tune into it, the quiet is deafening.
And that silence, it isn't just an aesthetic shift or like a lucky break for car washes.
Right, it's not a convenience.
No, this missing hum, this clean windshield phenomenon, it's a blaring systemic warning signal. I mean, we are looking at the collapse of the foundational architecture of the natural world.
The stakes are just massive.
They are. The insects we aren't hitting on the highway are the very mechanisms that sustain the entire terrestrial food web. So to grasp what we're talking about today, we really have to look past the absence of pests,
Yeah.
and recognize this quietness as the sound of profound structural failure.
When you say structural failure, the sheer math from the sources is what really stops you in your tracks.
The 75% stat?
Yes. Roughly 75% of flowering plants and just a staggering portion of global food production rely directly on these biological interactions.
It's almost too big of a number to comprehend.
Right. It means if you walk into a grocery store and hypothetically remove pollinators from the equation, the entire architecture of the human diet just collapses.
The produce section just vanishes.
Poof. Gone. Coffee, chocolate, almonds, apples, gone. We often treat bugs as like background noise, right? But they are quite literally bearing the weight of our entire agricultural system on their wings.
Absolutely. And the term from the texts to keep in mind here is biological indicator.
Let's break that down for everyone.
Sure. So an indicator species is an organism whose physiological health and population density are directly tied to the baseline functionality of its environment.
It's like the ecosystem's check engine light.
That is exactly it. When a biological indicator's population drops, it signifies that the underlying stability of the system is fracturing. But, we have a tendency in popular science to look for the meteor strike.
The big apocalyptic event.
Right, a single event wiping out a population. But the consensus across the systemic design literature points to a phenomenon known as cumulative stress load.
Cumulative stress load. I want to sit with that concept for a second because it really mirrors how biological systems, including humans, experience allostatic load or burnout.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Yeah, I mean, think about your own breaking points. It's rarely one giant catastrophic disaster that causes burnout, right? It's not a meteor.
It's the little things.
Exactly. It's the continuous low-grade friction. It's facing a nutritional deficit while simultaneously fighting off a mild toxin, while simultaneously losing a few hours of sleep, while simultaneously expending extra energy to just find shelter.
You're spending all your biological currency just trying to maintain a baseline state of survival.
Right, and eventually the adaptive capacity just bottoms out. You crash.
And that's the crux of the crisis for these insects. Pollinators don't require an extreme sci-fi wasteland to decline. What destabilizes them are small, relentless disruptions that just constantly overlap.
They just pile up.
Right, because any single one of these variables, say a sudden drop in a specific food source or a localized weather anomaly, an insect population can usually bounce back from that.
They've got evolutionary resilience.
Exactly. They have resilience built in for isolated stressors. But when you layer multiple systemic pressures on top of each other, simultaneously, you exceed the speed limit of evolution.
They physically cannot adapt fast enough.
No,
Yeah.
not to cope with the sheer volume of different overlapping pressures.
Which forces a really uncomfortable realization. If the system is crashing because of the 1,000 everyday stressors, identifying the culprit gets complicated.
Very complicated.
And human nature dictates that when a problem is incredibly complex and deeply structural, we immediately look for the easiest, most unassailable scapegoat.
Oh, without a doubt.
According to the architecture of accountability, that scapegoat is usually the weather. We just point at the sky and blame climate change.
Right, the psychology of distance is heavily at play here. Pointing to climate change as the sole reason for pollinator collapse is incredibly convenient.
Convenient how?
Well, it takes a deeply uncomfortable reality and abstracts it. It makes it distant.
Okay, wait, let's unpack this, though, because I struggle with this premise a little bit. We've spent a decade tracking how warming temperatures shift bloom times,
Oh,
right?
that's xenological mismatch.
Yes, exactly. Causing this massive mismatch where the flowers open weeks before the bees actually wake up from hibernation.
Mm-hmm.
Are these sources actually claiming climate change isn't a massive factor? Because that sounds pretty controversial.
No, they aren't dismissing the warming data at all. They are contextualizing it.
Okay.
Phenological mismatch is a real measurable phenomenon. However, using atmospheric warming as the primary scapegoat obscures the ground-level structural decisions happening every single day.
I see.
Climate change is a vast, global, seemingly invisible force. If the problem is global warming, the responsibility is spread so thinly across 8 billion people and multinational energy conglomerates that, well, no single local zoning board has to take the blame.
Or no specific agricultural conglomerate.
Exactly, and no individual homeowner has to feel accountable for the dead bees on their own sidewalk.
Right, if it's everyone's fault, it's no one's fault.
Precisely.
By blaming the invisible hand of global carbon emissions, I don't have to critically examine why I'm, say, spraying herbicides on my lawn this weekend. It's a mechanism for avoiding local accountability.
That's the underlying thesis of the sources. The collapse of pollinators is a reflection of local choices repeated at scale.
Local choices repeated at scale.
Yes. We are actively engineering physical landscapes where biological life cannot survive, and then acting shocked when the system fails.
And then just blaming it entirely on the changing weather.
Right.
So if we strip away the global climate excuse, what are the actual systems we've built? The texts outline 4 distinct manufactured stressors, right?
4 pillars of systemic design. Yeah.
4 pillars actively dismantling the biological network. Let's start with the first one, which underpins how we literally feed ourselves, the transition to massive agricultural monocultures.
So modern agriculture is a marvel of human engineering. I mean, it's optimized purely for yield and logistical efficiency.
Right, maximum output.
But to achieve that efficiency, we systematically eradicated diverse, complex ecosystems. Meadows, prairies, varied forests, we replaced them with vast, unbroken expanses of a single plant species.
Miles and miles of just one thing.
Right. Now, look at this from the perspective of an insect foraging for survival. A massive monoculture field, like the sprawling almond orchards in California.
It presents a biological paradox.
Yes.
The analogy that came to mind reading this is like an incredibly aggressive pop-up carnival buffet.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Imagine living in a city with 0 grocery stores, 0 restaurants, and no food in your pantry at all.
Okay, bleak.
Right. But once a year, a massive carnival rolls into town and offers a limitless, all-you-can-eat buffet. You gorge yourself. But 2 weeks later, the carnival packs up and leaves.
And you're left with nothing.
Exactly. The entire region instantly reverts to a total food desert. There is nothing to eat for hundreds of miles. That is the reality of a monoculture bloom for a pollinator.
It is a temporary, overwhelming feast, followed by an absolute devastating nutritional famine.
It's just feast or famine on a massive scale.
And, you know, the composition of that temporary feast introduces a secondary layer of biological harm. A single-crop diet is disastrous for the internal physiology of an insect.
Why is that? because they're just eating the same thing.
Yeah, pollinators, much like humans, rely on a highly complex gut microbiome to digest food, absorb nutrients, and crucially, to power their immune system.
Right, biodiversity in the gut.
Exactly. They need varied types of pollen, different amino acid profiles, different lipids to maintain that internal flora. When a bee is forced to consume only almond pollen or only canola pollen for weeks,
Its nutritional profile collapses.
completely.
So even when they are eating, they are fundamentally malnourished.
Yes.
Their immune systems are compromised from the inside out, which really perfectly primes the pump for the next layer of our engineered collapse.
The second pillar.
Right, because a malnourished insect with a weakened immune system is flying directly into a chemical gauntlet.
And this is where it gets really dark.
When people hear pesticides, I think the image that comes to mind is the classic aerosol can of bug spray. You spray a wasp, it drops to the floor, acute, immediate toxicity.
But the systemic design literature focuses on a much more insidious mechanism, sublethal dosing.
Let's talk about neonicotinoids.
Neonicotinoids, yes. These are not topical sprays that wash off in the rain. They are systemic chemicals.
Wait, what does systemic mean in this context?
It means they are applied as seed coatings. The plant absorbs the chemical as it grows. The toxin becomes integrated into the vascular tissue of the plant itself.
Oh, wow, so it's inside the plant.
It is present in the leaves, the stems, the nectar, and the pollen.
The pollen itself is toxic.
Yes. So when a pollinator visits that flower, it isn't sprayed with a lethal dose that kills it on the spot. It ingests a microscopic sublethal amount of the neurotoxin.
Which completely shifts the timeline of the collapse.
Yeah.
Let's dig into the actual biology of how this works. What is happening inside the insect when it ingests that contaminated nectar?
Neonicotinoids specifically target the central nervous system. They bind to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the insect's brain.
Okay, getting technical, I love it.
Right, so in a healthy nervous system, acetylcholine transmits a signal and then an enzyme clears it away so the nerve can rest.
Like a switch turning off.
Exactly, but the neonicotinoid binds to that same receptor and cannot be cleared by the enzyme. It causes continuous, unrelenting neural excitation.
The switch gets stuck in the on position.
Yes. And at a sublethal dose, this doesn't induce immediate paralysis. Instead, it profoundly degrades cognitive function.
They lose their spatial memory.
They do.
I mean, an insect's ability to navigate is one of the most complex mechanisms in the natural world. A bee uses a combination of sun compass routing, optic flow, and olfactory memory just to leave a hive, fly 3 miles away, locate a specific patch of flowers, and find its way exactly back to a tiny hole in a wooden box.
It is a biological supercomputer.
And the chemical exposure acts like a targeted virus in that supercomputer.
That's a perfect way to describe it. The continuous neural misfiring scrambles their internal GPS. It disrupts the optic flow processing they use to gauge distance and speed.
So they can get out there.
They gather the pollen, but they lose the cognitive map required to return home.
That is genuinely haunting.
It really is.
They don't die a violent death in the field. They fail slowly. They wander the landscape, neurologically compromised, weighed down with food they can't deliver.
Until they simply run out of energy and die of exposure alone in the dirt.
It's effectively a chemically induced dementia. We are systematically deleting their memory of home in exchange for crop yield.
That's exactly what the sources are arguing, yes.
And even if an insect somehow survives the monoculture famine and manages to navigate through that neurotoxic fog, it often flies right into the third trap we've built.
The modern urban landscape.
Urban fragmentation and sterile aesthetics.
Right. Because as we expand outward, we don't just replace nature with concrete. We fragment what little nature remains.
We chop it up into blocks.
A continuous functioning ecosystem is paved over, leaving behind isolated, disconnected islands of green space.
Right.
From a biological standpoint, a pollinator now has to expend an enormous amount of caloric energy crossing vast, impermeable deserts of asphalt and concrete just to reach the next patch of habitat.
And the truly bitter irony is what they find when they finally reach that oasis, right? Let's talk about the suburban yard, because the concept of sterile aesthetics from the reading is just fascinating.
It completely flips how you look at gardening.
It really does. We view gardening as this deeply natural green activity. But human horticulture has spent the last century breeding flowers entirely for visual drama.
We want massive neon blooms.
We want double, triple petals. But to get those extra layers of decorative petals, Horticulturists literally bred the reproductive organs, the stamen and pistils that hold the pollen and nectar right out of the plant.
The plant's biological utility is entirely sacrificed to satisfy human aesthetic preferences.
It's the equivalent of putting a bowl of intricately carved wax fruit on a dining room table.
Oh,
To a human walking past, it looks vibrant, colorful, and appealing. But if a starving person sat down and tried to take a bite, they'd realize it offers zero caloric value. It is biologically empty.
and we have draped our cities and suburban developments in thousands of acres of wax fruit.
We cultivate landscapes that look like nature but function like plastic.
It's an illusion, and that desire to control and optimize our environment doesn't stop when the sun goes down either.
The fourth massive disruption, artificial lighting.
Right. We tend to have a severe diurnal bias. We think of pollination as a daytime activity involving bees and butterflies.
Because that's what we see.
Exactly. But a colossal portion of the world's pollination network operates in the dark. Moths, specific beetles, and nocturnal bees have spent millions of years syncing their behavior to the darkest hours of the night.
Their entire biological rhythm, their circadian programming, is tied to the phases of the moon and the ambient light of the stars.
Yes, celestial navigation. They use it to keep a straight flight path, keeping the moon at a fixed angle to their eye.
Then we introduce an environment that refuses to sleep.
The system that never turns off.
Right. We blanket the landscape with intensely bright, broad-spectrum LEDs. Street lamps, illuminated billboards, stadium lights, residential security floods.
To a nocturnal insect relying on faint celestial cues, an LED street lamp is blinding. It entirely hijacks their navigational programming.
Because they attempt to keep this artificial, incredibly close light source at a fixed angle to their eye, right?
Yes, which forces them into a continuous tightening spiral.
That's why you see them endlessly circling a porch light.
Exactly. It's not that they love the light. They are trapped in a navigational loop they physically cannot break.
Oh, wow. I always thought they were just attracted to the warmth or something.
Oh, it's a trap. They are locked in these cycles of exhaustion until they literally drop dead onto the pavement from caloric depletion.
We've turned light into a physical barrier.
We have. When you synthesize these four elements, the nutritional famine, cognitive chemical disruption, biologically sterile architecture, and the eradication of the night, you realize the gravity of the term systemic design.
None of these factors are accidental.
No, they are the direct engineered outputs of a specific philosophy of human existence.
Which brings us to the psychology behind all of this. I mean, why did we build it this way? We didn't gather in a room and explicitly scheme to eradicate nocturnal moths or scramble a bee's memory.
No, it wasn't a malicious conspiracy against bugs.
So what's the driving force? The sources argue that this systemic design is a symptom of a profound shift in how humans relate to the natural world.
Right. We moved from participating in an ecosystem to demanding absolute tyrannical control over it.
Managing nature rather than living in it.
The literature frames this as the illusion of order. Historically, biological environments were infinitely complex, overlapping, and chaotic by human visual standards.
Plants grew in tangled webs. Decomposing matter piled up to create soil. Different species occupied every vertical inch of space.
But as human societies industrialized, we began to equate ecological complexity with messiness, with dirt, with a lack of civilization.
I see this most clearly in the history of the modern lawn.
Oh, the lawn is the perfect example.
If you trace the concept of the turf grass lawn back to 17th century European aristocracy, it was explicitly designed as a massive flex of wealth.
Literally just showing off.
Yeah. In an era where land was needed for growing food or grazing animals, having acres of perfectly cut, useless green grass was a way for lords to visually scream, "I am so incredibly wealthy that I can afford to waste this land purely for aesthetics."
And hundreds of years later, that aristocratic status symbol is the default setting for every suburban home.
We prioritize a geometric, visual order over biological function. We want the grass cropped to exactly 1.5 inches. We want sharp, aggressive edges where the concrete meets the soil.
We want a monoculture of Kentucky bluegrass, which provides absolutely no ecological value to the native food web.
And to maintain that illusion of order, we declared a ruthless chemical war on weeds.
We treat anything that interrupts our uniform green carpet as an invading force to be eradicated.
We spray broadleaf herbicides to kill dandelions and native clovers, but if you strip away the human bias, a dandelion isn't a weed.
No, biologically speaking, it's a pioneer species.
Right. It has a massive taproot that breaks up compacted soil, and more importantly, it is often the very first high-protein pollen source to emerge in the early spring.
When native bees wake up from winter dormancy on the brink of starvation, dandelions are their lifeline.
And our response to that critical biological lifeline is to poison it so our front yards can mimic a golf course.
We are aggressively stripping the landscape of its evolutionary function to satisfy an inherited cultural idea of tidiness.
It's just wild to think about it that way. The pollinators arrive in an environment expecting the abundance their instincts promised, and they find a sterile wasteland.
They are following millions of years of deeply ingrained genetic coding into spaces that no longer recognize that code.
Which raises a really important philosophical question about the insects themselves.
Oh.
When you look at the sheer scale of the hostility we've engineered, the neurotoxins, the starvation, the light pollution, it's very easy to assume that these insects are just hopelessly delicate.
Right.
Are they just an evolutionary dead end? Are they too fragile to survive the modern world, and we're just witnessing a harsh, inevitable survival of the fittest scenario?
The systemic design literature addresses this assumption head-on, and it offers what is arguably the most critical reframing in modern ecological thought.
What's the consensus?
The consensus states definitively, they are not fragile, they are precise.
Wow. They're not fragile, they are precise. That distinction is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Let's unpack the difference between fragility and precision in a biological context.
Fragility implies an inherent weakness, right? A biological flaw that causes an organism to fail under normal stress.
Like it was doomed to fail anyway.
Exactly. Precision, however, implies a staggeringly high level of sophisticated evolutionary tuning. Pollinators are exquisitely calibrated to microscopic shifts in their environment.
They can detect minute changes in floral chemistry, humidity, barometric pressure, and ultraviolet light patterns on petals.
They're the biological equivalent of highly advanced precision instruments.
I love the Formula One analogy here. If you take a finely tuned, multi-million-dollar Formula One engine and you fill the gas tank with beach sand, the engine is going to violently seize up and destroy itself.
Instantly.
You wouldn't look at the smoking wreckage and conclude, wow, what a fragile, badly designed engine.
Right, because it's not fragile.
It is a masterpiece of engineering that requires a highly specific, clean operating environment to perform. We have taken the precision engine of the global food web, poured neurotoxic sand into the gas tank, paved over the track, and then blamed the machine for breaking down.
That is exactly the point. The confusion, the navigation failures, the population collapses.
Yeah.
These are not flaws in their biology.
It's not a bug, it's a feature.
Literally. They are exactly how a precise system behaves when its operating parameters are fundamentally dismantled. The speed at which we have altered the chemical and physical landscape vastly outpaces the natural speed limit of evolutionary adaptation.
And that reframing entirely removes our ability to play the victim.
It forces accountability.
Right. If we view them as fragile, we can throw our hands up and say, well, it's a harsh world, species die out, nothing we can do.
And when we recognize their precision
and acknowledge that we are the ones who dismantled the parameters, the responsibility lands squarely back on our shoulders.
it does.
And frankly, confronting the sheer scale of agriculture, urban planning, and chemical regulation can induce a kind of ecological paralysis. It feels too deeply embedded in modern systems to ever unravel.
The scale of the engineered imbalance is definitely daunting, but the literature pivots here.
This is where we get some actionable hope.
Yes. The structural reality is that because these systems are the direct result of human choices, they can be modified by new human choices. The architecture is not permanent.
The phrase that jumped out at me from the analysis was, the silence is not final.
Such a powerful line.
It really is. It's a sharp counter to the doom scrolling we usually do around ecological collapse. So how do we actually reverse the engineering? If the problem is global and structural, how do we find an actionable scale for a solution?
The mechanism for recovery is rooted in the very precision we just discussed. Because these organisms are so deeply attuned to their environment, their biological response to favorable conditions is incredibly rapid.
They don't require centuries to bounce back.
No, not at all. The biological reality is, if you reintroduce the proper inputs, the system immediately attempts to repair itself.
Give them food and shelter.
Exactly. If you provide a continuous, varied source of native pollen, their gut microbiomes heal. If you remove the sublethal chemical exposure, their spatial memory and navigation capabilities begin to stabilize within a single generation.
It's not a lost cause.
Uh,
They are actively waiting for the pressure to drop.
They have the biological drive to survive and multiply. They just need us to stop actively suffocating them.
But when we talk about solutions, the texts focus on surprisingly small-scale actions.
The power of accumulation.
Right. They talk about planting native microhabitats in window boxes, shifting demand to local farms, leaving a few square feet of wild growth in a backyard, or simply replacing a bright white porch light with a motion sensor amber bulb.
Seems too simple, right?
Yeah, how does turning off a porch light or planting a single window box of native coneflowers actually compete with millions of acres of neurotoxic monoculture?
It comes down to the concept of spatial connectivity. Ecosystems are not singular, monolithic entities. They are decentralized networks built on the accumulation of millions of micro-interactions.
Say we don't have to fix the whole globe at once.
No. The goal outlined in the systemic design literature is not an impossible utopian reversion to a pre-industrial wilderness. We're not going to bulldoze our cities and abandon modern agriculture.
The goal is to integrate ecological function into the human infrastructure.
Precisely. It's about creating nodes.
Nodes. So if I plant a diverse array of native pollen-rich flowers in my front yard and I stop spraying herbicides, I'm not just making a pretty garden.
You are building a functional node. You are creating a biological refueling station.
A refueling station, I like that.
To a human, a 3-foot patch of native wildflowers seems insignificant. But to a foraging bee navigating an urban desert, that patch is the critical caloric bridge that allows it to survive the journey between your yard and the community park 3 blocks away.
You're stitching the fragmented map back together?
Yes.
If I have a node, and my neighbor leaves their dandelions for the spring, and the local library plants a rooftop pollinator garden, suddenly we've built an invisible, high-functioning ecological corridor right over the top of the concrete grid.
We are bypassing the sterile aesthetic of the city and overlaying a biological network.
And as those corridors accumulate, the cumulative stress load fractures.
The nutritional diversity strengthens their immune response.
The lack of localized pesticides clears the neurological fog.
The darkness allows the nocturnal species to navigate and mate. We are slowly dismantling the 4 pillars of systemic collapse.
Not through sweeping global mandates, but through the accumulation of functional microhabitats.
Which puts the agency entirely back into the hands of the individual.
That is so empowering. You don't need a massive grant to let the clover grow in your grass.
Yeah.
You don't need an international climate summit to swap out an LED bulb for something that doesn't blind nocturnal moths.
No, you just have to make a choice. It's a fundamentally empowering realization that shifting our aesthetic values away from the illusion of order can have immediate, measurable biological impacts.
We just have to learn to see the inherent beauty in a landscape that is messy, complex, and alive, rather than a landscape that is sterile, uniform, and dead.
It requires an evolution in our cultural perception of nature. We must transition from seeing ourselves as managers imposing order on a chaotic world to seeing ourselves as participants in a deeply precise, functioning network.
A functioning network. That is the perfect encapsulation of what we've unpacked today.
It's been a journey.
It really has. We started by looking at a clean windshield and realizing that the profound quiet settling over our environment is actually the blaring alarm of structural collapse.
We pushed past the psychological comfort of blaming the global climate.
And forced ourselves to look at the local, ground-level choices we make every day. We examined the architecture of that collapse, the devastating nutritional famine created by our monoculture buffets,
The invisible neurotoxic fog scrambling the cognitive maps of our pollinators.
the biological deception of our aesthetically pleasing but entirely sterile urban landscapes, and the eradication of the ancient circadian rhythms through artificial lighting.
And we completely reframed how we view the victims of this design. They are not fragile remnants of a bygone era.
They are precise, brilliant biological instruments responding exactly as they should to an environment that has been flooded with poison and concrete.
But the ultimate takeaway is the resilience of the network.
Right. We learned that ecosystems are waiting to heal, and that the accumulation of localized, seemingly small human choices can actually stitch the fragmented world back together.
The systemic analyses leave us with a deeply philosophical pivot, though, one that requires us to examine our own role in the ecosystem.
What's that final thought?
Well, we spent an enormous amount of time and resources asking why the pollinators are declining. But the literature suggests we are asking the wrong question.
So what is the right question?
The real question is, why did we design a world where they no longer belong? What is the true cost of our obsession with visual order?
Why did we design a world where they no longer belong? That is such a heavy, important question. And it's the exact thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. I want to issue a direct challenge to you based on that very question.
I love a good challenge.
Tomorrow, when you step outside your front door, whether you are walking down a suburban sidewalk, passing a corporate office park, or looking at your own backyard, I want you to critically examine the landscaping.
Look past the sharp edges.
Look past the pristine mulch and the neon double-petaled flowers, and ask yourself one simple question. Is this space actually designed for life, or is it merely designed for looking at?
That's the core of it.
Because if we can begin to choose the messiness of life over the illusion of order, maybe next summer, we will finally have to squeegee our windshields again. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take care of yourselves, and remember, let those dandelions grow just a little bit longer.